Hi everyone, my name's Chris. I'm a psychologist who works for States of Mind and various other different people. I'm going to explain a bit more about that in a minute, but today we're going to talk about a project that States of Mind are running called Breaking the Silence. And the purpose of the presentation today is to do these three things essentially. So we want to explain a little bit, for not very long really, about who States of Mind are and what Breaking the Silence is as a project, and then have a think about what are the next steps that might emerge from this project in combination with some of the other great work that people are doing out there, much of which has been, I'm sure, presented at this conference. So if you want to log into the Mentee Meter, please do. I mean, this is one of the tools that we used as part of the project, and it will become clear what this means and why it's powerful later. But if you've got your mobile phone with you, I assume everyone's got a mobile phone to hand, please feel free, if you want to interact with the presentation, to type in www.mentee.com. I promise you it's worth it. It's quite an entertaining and interesting way of engaging with presentations and actually contributing to the slides and literally co-creating ideas together. So I'll give you guys a bit of time to do that, but
does it work on a laptop, Chris?
Yes, absolutely, yeah. So you can open up another window and do it on your laptop if you want, totally. And I wanted to center this at the beginning because I think it's a really amazing, powerful tool to work with young people and anyone really in terms of gathering information and creating content together. I'll say a bit more about that as we go through the presentation, but it'll be at the top the whole way through, folks. So you'll be able to see what website to go onto and which code to type in. Very straightforward. But do feel free to unmute yourself if you get stuck and just ask me a question about how to do it. But you should all be able to get your heads around it relatively straightforwardly, I think. Okay, so what you should see if you're on the Mentee Meter is the slides appearing before your very eyes. And feel free to type in, and this is all going to be anonymous because Mentee Meter contributions are always anonymous, unless you wish to say, Jackie, brilliant. You can write your name if you wish, but also you can just throw something in anonymously. And what you'll notice here is it pops up on the screen. It will be more clear why I'm bothering to show you this Mentee Meter later, because it was very, very powerful working with the young people as part of this Breaking the Silence project. So, yeah, go for it. How are you feeling today? We're going to get a nice word cloud pop up now, hopefully. So we've got someone is exhausted. Content, that's good to hear. Someone's feeling loved. Always nice to see that at the start of a presentation. Excited, great stuff. And what you'll notice with the word clouds is that they get bigger, the words get bigger depending on how many times the word is used. So what we've seen here is a pretty wide spread of emotions, really. Overwhelmed, exhausted, excited, inspired. Great stuff. So thanks for your honesty as well, folks. It's good to hear that there's a range of people in the room feeling very different ways. So that's just one of the things the Mentee Meter can do, and we're going to come back to that. And it looks like tired is the prevailing experience people are having at the moment, which is not surprising after all this time watching, obviously, a lot of inspiring presentations, but you've probably had a lot going on and are getting to the point now where you've had enough. So I'm going to make this a snappy rock and roll presentation. That's the plan anyway. Okay, so a little tiny bit about me. So I'm an educational psychologist. I used to be a teacher. I was a teacher for 5 years in secondary schools. And I've developed a specialism as a psychologist around working with young people in the youth justice system, young people in the prisons, child prisons and secure units, and in pupil referral units. So that's my background experience and my specialism at the moment. I also do quite a bit of writing for media like newspapers sometimes, and doctorate research, and sometimes journal articles. And I work at the Institute of Education supervising doctorate students at the moment. That will become important later. And I'm director of research at an organization called States of Mind, who we're going to talk a bit about today. And there's my website. If anyone wants to look at it, what I'll do is I'll send this presentation round at the end, and if people want to check it out, they can. So that's where I'm coming from. I think someone's unmuted there. Is that you, Derry? Can you mute yourself? I've just got a bit of background noise coming through. Perfect. Okay, so states of mind. So we're an organization that started in 2017, 2018, co-founded with a young person at the time called B. Herbert. She's in her late 20s, really fascinating person. And she would have liked to be here today, but she unfortunately had something else that she had to attend. So we're a social enterprise, and we have a core purpose, which is this. So what we want to try and do is provide young people with the psychological skills, knowledge, and self-awareness that's required for them to thrive in the world. We focus very carefully on understanding and addressing the social causes of young people's distress. So we take a position that's very much antithetical to the medical model in psychology. We're trying to work with young people directly to elicit their voices and place them in places where those voices actually have value and are listened to and actually acted upon. And all of our work is done alongside young people with the aim of supporting their psychological health and challenging systems. And in this particular case, the education system. So fire away and use the Mentee Meter. I'd be really interested to see what people think about this and where you guys are coming from as a cohort. What do you think the causes are of emotional distress for young people? And these are the kind of questions we would ask the students in our research, which I'm going to explain in more depth in a minute. But I'm really intrigued to see what you guys think, because this is our main starting point at States of Mind with all of the work we do with young people.
How do we comment, Chris?
Right, so you should see, if you type in, have you logged onto the Mentee Meter, Derry? Oh, I think you've gone quiet again, Derry. I don't know why. Can't hear you now.
I'm self-muting.
Okay.
It's very painful.
Yeah. I think if you type that code in, you should be able to, it should just come up on your screen.
Where do you type the code?
Okay, so if you go in, if you look at the top of the screen that I'm sharing, it says www.mentee.com. See that?
Yep.
If you go on that website, it'll ask you to type in a code. Once you type in a code, it should come up. And then you can comment.
So that's not a link. I've got to go into the website.
Yes, you have to go into it.
Okay.
So we've got a few interesting ideas here. Thank you for this, everybody. So lack of vision for the future, very interesting. And what you can do with the Mentee Meter in the presentations is you can sort of pull out things that are interesting and enhance them like this. So absolutely.
Could someone type in school for me before it goes?
Yeah, I think you can type it more than twice. Very interesting one, that, isn't it? That's going to come up certainly in this presentation. Adults, very interesting. This has really become headline news, hasn't it, in the last decade or so? A lot more focus on trauma, a lot more focus on early childhood experiences. And I'd be interested to know what the person means by expectations. I think I can probably infer what's meant by that, but feel free to write a bit more if you think that's helpful. That's a very interesting one. States of mind, we're doing a lot of work around that one, and you'll be happy to know, Derry, and Derry's already seen a bit about this project before, but we're thinking a lot about school contexts and things like institutionalized mistreatment and self-determination or lack thereof. Thank you for that, folks. I'll send this around at the end so you can have all this. So that's our starting point, really, asking those sort of questions about young people, and the Breaking the Silence project emerged from that. So I'm just going to walk you through the project and let you know a little bit about it. Feel free to stop and ask questions whenever you like, folks. But first of all, it's really interesting to me. Does anybody know, or has anyone heard of or been involved in participatory action research? So you've got an opportunity now to again use the Mentee Meter, so you can say yes, no, not sure. Let's see who we've got who has had some interactions with it. So someone's not sure. Okay, fab. Someone, yes, brilliant. Okay. There's absolutely no pressure to do so, but if the person saying yes would like to say what that was, that would be really interesting to me, because there's not millions of us out there doing this sort of research, and I'd be really interested to know what that looked like. If anyone would like to comment.
I can't remember an awful lot because it was many, many years ago when I was doing my, I forget whether it was my master's or one of the other things. But what I do remember is having a sense of the freedom to be able to listen. And I think the children, I always taught special education, that they actually had a say in what was going on. So that was what stuck with me, how valuable it was. I wished every teacher had been doing something like that.
That's a great point, Jackie. Yeah, and I think what you've described there is the really core part of participatory action research, which is around young people being participants and not subjects or objects. You know, being fully involved members of the process themselves and shaping reality.
Yeah. Yeah, actors was the word I used.
Yeah.
I was involved with a lot of Mike Fielding's and Sarah Bragg's students as researchers work, and worked with groups in about 8 schools at one time.
Sure.
I don't know whether you'd count that as participatory action research, but it was certainly student-led. You'll know about Students as Researchers project, I guess.
I do indeed, Derry, yeah, and it was really interesting you mentioned Michael Fielding's work, and his books were the real source of inspiration for us, actually, in terms of triggering this work. And I noticed that you were involved in that when I was reading about it. You know, we need to thank you, people like yourselves, Derry, and Michael and others, for sort of inspiring this kind of work. So just to explain a little bit what participatory action research looks like, for those who are less initiated, it's a really transformative process for the students and for those like myself, researchers involved in it. And there's 3 essential elements to it. So obviously the first element is it's participatory, and that what that really means is equal collaboration of all parties. So what you're trying to do is empower the young people involved in the project to take action in real life scenarios that are actually meaningful to them, and to take action in scenarios where they can actually shape things that impact on other young people in the same spaces who are participating in the same contexts. And there's huge power in that, which we'll come up to a bit later. And obviously the research element of that is you're working with the young people, placing them equitably alongside yourself. So everyone is part of the research on an equal footing. There's no power hierarchy between myself and doctorate students who I supervise and work with us. There's no hierarchy between us and the young people we work with, who tend to be 17-year-olds in England, what we call year 12. So they're just a year before their A levels. And the research element is different in each phase. So I'm going to now talk you through a little bit about the phases of the Breaking the Silence project and try and make it sort of visible and create a bit of a visceral picture for you about what it looks like in action. Again, feel free to stop and ask anything. But before I do that, I just wanted to share with you, Schneider did a really good piece of work in 2012, breaking down what participatory action research is. And the bits that I really like to pull out there are the first bit there, the commitment to the participation of ordinary people. And what he means by that is people living, people involved in participatory forms of life within whatever context that might be. And it really is about respecting everyone as having knowledge, not walking in with a, shall we suggest, top of the hierarchy, bombastic sense that I know more than you, because that's not necessarily particularly helpful if you're trying to help young people to create a reality that's meaningful and powerful for them. And you're always holding in mind that, you know, even when you're trying to do that, I'm certainly aware as a psychologist, having worked with young people in the prison population and the pupil referral units for many years, even if you go in with that attitude, they still often perceive themselves as marginalized and disempowered. So holding that in mind is really important. And the idea is that participatory action research really can promote social justice. And within that framework, obviously, there are some goals, and you want to produce knowledge. You want to produce some knowledge that is co-created with young people in this case, and take action. And you want it to be transformative. You don't want it to just go nowhere and sit on a shelf and not be used anymore. So with that in mind, we launched the project in 2019, and I, at that point, became a doctorate research supervisor at the Institute of Education. So what we've got is states of mind working in collaboration with the Institute of Education at University College London. And with each iteration of the Breaking the Silence project, we have a doctorate student come in and work with the students and collate all the information. That makes sense. So we're always making sure that we capture all the amazing knowledge that comes out of the sessions. So phase one was 2019. And what I'll do at the end, if it's all right, is I'll send round to people who want it. I mean, I can probably send it around to the attendees of the festival generally, a sort of summary of the project in case anyone wants to follow up and contact us and think about it. But in 2019, some of you who are from England might remember there was an Ofsted consultation. Now, for those of you who don't know and are not from England, Ofsted are the body that's supposed to be non-governmental, they're supposed to be adjacent to the government and independent. And what they're supposed to do is assess the relative capacity of schools to meet the needs of students. What had never been asked, and there's just layers and layers of somewhat dark irony to this, is no one's ever asked students what they think about how their education looks, feels, and meets their needs. So Ofsted were doing a consultation about the way they operate, about the way they evaluate and assess schools. We obviously thought, well, no one's asking young people here what they think about how their schools are assessed, which is a yawning gap which defies all human rights legislation and is horrendously disempowering. So we decided to go and speak to some students. And this was our first sort of brainwave idea. What are we going to do? How are we going to actually try and change things here? So we went in and spoke to 80 students. We did focus groups. So that's a lot of focus groups with 80 students. And then we pulled together a cohort of student innovators. That's what we call them. And each iteration of Breaking the Silence, there's a new cohort. It's usually about 3 students volunteer of student innovators. And in this iteration, which was the first phase, what they decided to do is write a letter to Ofsted. So they wrote a letter to Amanda Spielman, who's the head of Ofsted, which is very powerful. It was about 4 pages long. And it very eloquently and coherently described what the problems are of assessing, as Ofsted do, essentially a school curriculum that tends to be extremely rigid and coercive, high stakes exam results, and things like behavior and attitudes. None of this was decided by young people. And the young people were telling us that the way that their schools are evaluated are really quite damaging to the way schools operate and the way schools construct what children are and position them as commodities, essentially. So this letter was really powerful. And again, you can see this letter on our website. And that was the title. So they didn't want to pull any punches. You know, they said, we're not learning, we're memorizing. They also talked about damage to mental health. They also talked about lack of identity. They talked about the fact that education doesn't prepare you for life. It doesn't really give you a sense of personal development. So they got very excised about this process and obviously sent that letter. And we waited a while. I mean, with a bit of pressure on social media, we got a response, which was what we knew was going to happen, a sort of pat on the head. There you go, children. Thank you for that. Bothered. It was that sort of response. Nothing was really taken into account. Nothing was responded to in a meaningful way. And they essentially said, you know, keep making your voices heard, but, you know, whatever. So then we thought, well, we need to keep this project going. We need to keep building on this. So the next academic year was phase 2. And we got a bit of media coverage of this project in a few places, I think TS being one of them. And then we realized, well, this is just the first phase. You know, we need to keep this evolving. We need to keep this rolling. So in phase 2, a new cohort of students came along, a new year 12, 17-year-old cohort of students came along, and they read the letter the students wrote. They read the response from Ofsted, the school assessors in England, and they wanted to go deeper. So they wanted to say, okay, what's the impact of schooling on their identity, psychological health, and personal development of young people? So that was another year-long project where B and I were working with students every week, helping them to understand research methods, helping them to go out and unpick these really complex issues. And what did this look like? So hundreds of students filled in questionnaires. about a dozen or more took part in focus groups. A doctorate student called Jasper, who's an absolute legend, he took part with us and he pulled together all the data from the focus groups and questionnaires, and he presented it back to the students, and we've shared it on our States of Mind blog and in various other places. And things started to pick up a bit here. So some of the students testified to the Education Select Committee on a number of occasions. So they were talking as directly as they can to government, which is quite powerful. They presented at various conferences. Most notably, the last one was the Education Futures in Action Conference, which I know Derry came to, and maybe some others who are coming to the festival went to. And the students presented their ideas at this conference, and it was really fascinating to observe people's reaction to it. And this is to me, one of the students. I deliberately took a photo of her here, looking to the side, looking a bit weird. She'd hate me for that, but I just thought it was quite amusing. So this is just one slide of many, many slides that they put into their presentation, which basically unraveled, based on the outcomes of their questionnaires and focus groups. It really unraveled the education system from the point of view of students, and essentially just look back right the way to primary school. And apologies if that's a bit small, folks, but they talked about, and this was something I wasn't necessarily expecting. They talked really powerfully about being like 9 and 10 years old in primary school when they do their SATs, which is one of the first times that young people in England are subject to high stakes assessments, and feeling that from the age of 10, they'd become commodities. They become products of the school, really. And they became students, and identity outside being a student became something that wasn't particularly championed by schooling. And obviously with the GCSE years, that became extra specially problematic, and it was causing an enormous amount of mental health problems for young people. And then it just continued. So you go into your A levels after that in England when you're 17 and 18. And they had this sort of overwhelming sense of focusing on memorization, being treated as commodities, etc. All the problems that you guys will all be aware of in terms of education, and this sort of disparity that they talked about around the way you're taught to think and learn in school and what's required and useful in the real world. So this is phase 2 of the Breaking the Silence project. And obviously this is essentially the views of many, many students pulled together and presented by 3 highly intelligent young women, actually, student innovators at all these different conferences and in these different spaces. And they came up with some extremely innovative solutions, which we'll come to in a minute. But again, this is the focus group outcomes that came from asking those students questions, about what does school do around your mental health? How does it contribute to your identity? What does it do in terms of your personal development, etc.? And as you can see there, so the purple comments are the ones that are most prevalent. So stress was by far the most prevalent factor. They're all explaining very, very high levels of stress, which we know from other research as well. And identity came up in various different ways. And again, apologies, it's quite small, guys. Mentee Meter is not the best thing for posting these kind of really intricate pictures. But again, I'll send it around with loads of links if people want to read more in more depth. So identity problems were huge. Students saying they didn't feel that they had a sense of identity outside being a student, and anything that they wanted to do that was an interest or something that they found intrinsically motivating were not able to be accessed very easily, or things that they were being pushed aside. And mental health problems was another really prominent one. You can see that on the left at the bottom there, and links with that, things like depression and anxiety, sleep disorders, disordered eating. And then another one, which I didn't know the students would come up with, but if you look at the top left there, over here, talking a lot about, the unfairness of exams, not fairly measuring student ability, and creating a competitive environment that doesn't respond to individual differences. So I guess the thing that we were amazingly struck by with this was the eloquence and the power of these findings that was so clear. They're unambiguous, really. And these are reflected in other pieces of research in England, like the Good Childhood Report, data that the OECD released about the mental health of young people in England, etc. And we also did, some quantitative data gathering as well. And what we found was, mostly students didn't feel that their mental health and well-being was very well supported by the education system. Most tended to either strongly agree, disagree, or weren't sure. So hugely problematic in phase 2. So then we thought, well, what are we going to do next? First of all, what did they think the solutions were? So they tended to think the solutions, which you guys will all be highly aware of being at the Summerhill Festival, were giving young people autonomy and control and choice, participating in their own lives, and having diverse success criteria of education that were at least to some extent chosen by students. They wanted to be able to judge their own success. They didn't want people to be impinging upon them and telling them what a great person looks like. And if they don't fit into that round hole, if they're a square peg, they essentially get marginalized. And then obviously they wanted to think more about education being about life skills and personal development. So has anyone got any comments or questions so far? That was phases 1 and 2. We've just finished phase 3, which I'm going to explain in a minute. Has anyone got any thoughts on that? And I would assume that most people here would have seen similar things to this and absorbed similar messages from young people.
I'm waiting with interest, Chris, when you get to the action bit. What did the students actually do about it, apart from talk at conferences? What effect did they have on the regimes in the schools that they came from?
Yeah. So one of the things they did in the schools in which this is happening now, we're moving this on, Derry. So the phase 3 bit is the action bit. If that makes sense. So, anyone else got any comments or questions? Okay, great.
It's just not surprising that our young people have something to say, that those of us, you know, involved in democratic education or alternatives have been able to figure out or hear from the learners. So, you know, it just, anyway.
Yeah, they're crying out for change, aren't they? Clearly. I mean, those themes are pretty strong, aren't they? And there's a lot of huge amount of distress going on. So we were like, well, we don't want this to just, as Derry said there, we don't just want this to end and go nowhere. So we wanted to move it on. Hi, David. Feel free to unmute yourself.
So one observation I had when I speak to a couple of my teacher friends is that quite often the teachers will acknowledge that there are these kind of institutionalized problems just inherent in the system. But then they go, oh, but it doesn't happen like that in my school.
Yeah.
So just a complete denial of it, you know. Yeah.
That's an interesting point, David. And we did another piece of research, but I'm not actually sharing with this particular presentation, where we asked teachers and young people, what do you think are the things that most impact upon your mental health? And the teachers tended to say social media and family issues, whereas 90% of the young people were saying the exam system and schooling. So there's a fundamental disconnect often between what teachers perceive to be the issues at hand and what students are reporting, which is one of the things we're trying to do with the next phase of the project, which I'm very happy to move on to, unless anyone else has any comments or questions. Okay, let's do it.
Can I? Sorry, it's just a quickie.
It's muted.
Am I?
Gail. She looks like she's speaking, but she's muted.
I think she's not talking to us.
Oh, okay.
Go on, Derry.
Well, no, I just threw out the comment that I used to find when we talked about education as a sort of sociological issue with the sixth formers in the school where I was vice principal.
Yeah.
They were always shocked to learn that the system is skewed with the bell curve to fail 30% of the entrants.
Sure.
And we can all predict who it's going to fail. In other words, the school system appears to be designed to put down large numbers of people and make them feel useless. So what's really going on? Who benefits? If you ask the cui bono question, who's benefiting for this outrage?
Yeah, I think that was basically my presentation in the Ed Futures conference, Terry, wasn't it, about the myth of three and the hierarchy created by the education system that deliberately puts people into a triarchic group of three of high attainers, low attainers, and relatively unintelligent people, it seems to me to be very much benefiting a very narrow cohort at the top of society, doesn't it? And essentially removing anyone else from opportunities and creating an idea that they are somehow lesser than because the people are only judged based on academic results. That would be my quick answer, but a really good question, Derry. The one that's sort of an endlessly evolving one. I need to move on. Okay, so also, Derry, I like the question about action. So what do the students do? Where does this go? So we asked the students at the end of phase 2, what do you think should happen next? And they came up with this amazing idea. What would happen if you designed an alternative education evaluation framework? What would happen if young people actually designed a way of evaluating their own education provision? And this was last year's project. So I've said 4 steps, there's actually 5 steps. So we set it up, we got another cohort of young people, 12 of them from 2 different colleges in Newham Borough, a very poor borough of London. And we got them together. These are the people that some members of the government will say don't want to learn. They'll say they're not interested in learning, they don't want to engage. So these are young people who are phenomenally interested in changing their lives and changing their experience and actioning change. So we settled them in for a bit. Then we got them to understand what school inspection and education evaluation looks like in England now. So we shared the Ofsted framework with them. And then we started looking at wider research. So how are schools evaluated in other countries? And we looked at various different data showing how things are done very differently in other places. Then we worked with them around research methods and data collection because we wanted them to go and find out more. We wanted them to go and, as it says there, interview head teachers, interview people like Derry, who actually took part. So thank you for that, Derry. We interviewed ex-Ofsted inspectors. We interviewed teachers. We did focus groups with young people and teachers. So we had this absolutely amazing thing going on where we had these 12 young people who were 17 years old going around doing head teacher interviews, running focus groups with teachers, interviewing ex-Ofsted inspectors and asking amazingly pertinent, interesting questions to try and figure out what might an education evaluation framework look like if it was designed in a way that we think is more humane and actually works for young people to help them flourish. And they came up with this idea called the Review for Progress and Development. This is just the first paragraph of their rationale. If people want to share the draft, we absolutely can do. So they came up with a really clear rationale for why they wanted to do things differently. And for those who don't know, Ofsted, I'll read a bit of this paragraph in a minute, but Ofsted come in from outside. They're an external auditing organization. And they come in for a couple of days and they make a judgment on the school based on 2 days without any prior knowledge of the school whatsoever. And the young people saw that as incredibly problematic for various reasons. And I'll just let you guys read. This is just the first paragraph that they wrote in rationalizing their version of the what they would call the Review for Progress and Development.
Has this gone to Amanda Spielman yet?
Not yet, Derry. No, we're still refining it. I'll tell you about that in a minute. That's the next bit.
Be interesting to see if you get another patronising sort of put down.
It really will, yeah. So as you can see from this, everyone agreeing that students, it sounds so obvious and absurd, doesn't it, that students are not asked about how their own education is evaluated. No one's tracking their interests, their preferences and their thoughts on it. And there's loads more on this, obviously. I just wanted to share with you the first paragraph. So they talked a lot about students acting differently during inspections, making them completely invalid in themselves, even on their own terms. And also tracking, in reflection of other research, the fact that basically nobody thinks that the current Ofsted inspection framework is helpful or valid or humane or helps. And that's teachers, young people as well. And we got to that point at the end of last year, and they wanted it to be this, which I thought was fascinating. Yeah, please go for it.
Just quickly, what was roughly the sample size of the questionnaire of students and teachers?
Yeah. Oh, for this particular bit. So what they did for this bit is they mainly did interviews and focus groups for this particular element of the process. And Jasper, who's the doctorate student who we work with, he's writing this up as part of his doctorate thesis. So he's writing a whole thesis on the results. So he's going to pull out and theme all of the interviews and focus groups that took place to make a really clear sort of showing of what the results showed, if that makes sense. So obviously there's a bit of a lag time with research, so we have to wait for the actual outcomes to come out. But what we would do is every week we would meet, and the students who'd taken part in the interviews or focus groups would feed back the findings, so that we had a sort of live updates around what the students were finding, that people were saying, reflecting on the current Ofsted framework and thinking about what it might look like. Has that answered your question?
Yes, I was just trying to find out really how many,
Sure.
get an idea of maybe schools that participated.
Yeah, so teachers participated from 2 different schools, and in the phase 2, though, the previous phase, there were about 500 students who did the questionnaire, and there were 3 or 4 focus groups with students as well.
Okay,
So
great.
it depends on which phase of the project it is. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it was kind of the percentages that you gave in the previous slide. It was just wanted to know, but you said about 500. Great, thanks.
I think it was about 500, yeah. So it's a really decent size, questionnaire stream. Your hand up, Derry.
Yes, it is, yeah. Chris, could you say a bit about the schools that these investigating teams come from? Does the cohort come from the same 2 schools? And I know that one of the schools is School 21. The bunch who came to talk to me were from School 21. They were a pretty impressive bunch, but this is a pretty atypical school. So can you just say a little bit about the 2 schools?
Yeah, that's a good point. So the other school is called London Academy of Excellence, which is what you would call a classic, almost grammar school approach. So we've got School 21, and for those who don't know School 21, it's quite an interesting secondary school. It still operates within the state sector in England, but they do try and engage a lot more with project-based learning, and they do try and provide students with a lot more self-determination and autonomy than other schools do. But the other half of the student cohort came from a school called London Academy of Excellence, which is much more academic and much more what we call a classic model of an English 6th form. So they're quite different. But what we were finding is the students were coming in with very similar experiences in many ways, even from School 21, because they all have to do the same exams, don't they? And they all have to go through, to a large extent, similar processes. So yeah, it's complicated stuff, and it's always difficult, isn't it, getting your sample right? And you have to do it to a certain extent based on who you can find who'll do it. Yeah.
I'm sorry to keep going, but do the groups that move into the research role every year, do they talk to the people who were involved the previous year?
Yes, they do. So we're doing phase 4 now. I'll explain that at the end, Derry, actually.
Okay.
It's a really good question. I'm going to explain a bit more about the participatory action research process at the end. But with this, what the students wanted is, I think I've explained, they created a rationale. And what they did, they're following some other countries of Europe who prioritize, people like Finland and Estonia, etc., who prioritize continuous school self-evaluation. And they thought the idea was really powerful. And most of their interviewees were saying similar things, that they think that the people who know best about their own school, funnily enough, are the teachers and the students in that school, not some random people coming out from outside to assess them externally. And they thought it'd be really great, as other countries do in some cases as well, for schools to partner with another local school to sort of co-evaluate each other in a much more safe, non-threatening and supportive fashion. Those of you who are in England will know that Ofsted has quite a poor reputation in many ways for being a relatively threatening organisation that can close schools down and force them to become academies, change their management structures by coercion. So the young people wanted to move away from that, really strongly away from that. And the way they wanted this continuous self-evaluation to operate is through this. This was just a diagram drawn by one of the students, but the idea is you have focus groups. So what they decided would be ideal would be focus groups with 3 different cohorts of students every year, and teacher focus groups 3 times a year as well. And you can see here, they wanted to rotate teachers from different faculties coming to take part in focus groups. And they really like the idea of the focus groups being co-led by young people and teaching staff. So you'd have like a almost a review of progress and development action team in the school who would work together to put together the focus groups and evaluate the data together. That might be supported by the school's educational psychologist, might be supported by different members of the school team, SLT and others. So this was their idea, and we're going to be refining this year. I'm very aware I'm going quite quickly and there's loads of information that's quite complex here. You got your hand up, Derry? Or was that a shadow hand? Might be a shadow hand. Okay, so they're looking at, briefly speaking, continuous school self-evaluation, schools evaluating themselves with the support of another local partner school and doing it through focus groups so you can actually access the genuine thoughts and feelings as best you can of the human beings who are taking part in that education provision. And there are a number of things they thought would be the most powerful things to measure, which they've drawn from their work interviewing, doing focus groups and reading the academic research. And these were the areas that they thought were most prominent. And this is a draft, so it took us a whole academic year to get to the point where they'd come up with all this, because it's so complicated, as you might imagine, to try and think about a student-led education evaluation framework. But they thought the review for progress and development would best measure these things. Like I said, this is rough. We're going to refine that this year. But some of the things really strike me about this. So obviously student voice being in the center seems like a crucial point. Mental health being an absolutely crucial point as well, which is not measured at all really in the current Ofsted framework. And the way they define quality of teaching, I thought was really interesting in particular, because you can probably see on the left-hand side here, this one of the core things that they perceive to be quality of teaching is the extent to which teachers have autonomy. So the students, they're 17 years old, and they can see that teachers having no autonomy is toxic. And they were really clear on this. And when they said learning in all subjects, what they mean here, and obviously this is written in a bit more depth in the document itself, the rough document itself, is they mean equal understanding of subjects. In other words, there's no sort of hierarchy of subjects. So they really were not interested, and they didn't like the concept of core subjects, because that essentially marginalizes people who are not academic thinkers. So they're very clear on that. The two bottom ones, this was incredibly important to them in all phases of breaking the silence. They're finding that there's no capacity for them at school to contemplate anything around life skills or personal development, as everything is so narrowly done through a top-down curriculum. And this is the kicker. This is the one that, and I love this one because this came at the end of the project. To begin with, this was amazing. The students were very, very, not anti-teachers, but mistrustful of teachers. And they always are when we speak to them, because there's an artificial barrier, isn't there, in mainstream schooling put between teachers and young people for them to make authentic human relationships is almost suggested as a bad thing. There's things that you hear all the time in English schools, like, teachers, we don't smile until Christmas because we need to control the class. You know, and that comes from the way schools were evaluated, doesn't it? If they're evaluated only on results, they're going to hothouse children and make sure that those students are nice little commodities. So what they realized as they went through was, actually, when they interviewed the teachers, they started to understand what the teachers were going through and how difficult it was for the teachers. And they realized that actually the teachers really want to help them, and that teacher-student relationships are something that's inherently lacking in our education system. And a way to do that is to actually evaluate that as a school, evaluate the belongingness of the school, essentially. If I was to use a psychological construct, they're talking about the belongingness that people experience in the school, and that includes both students and teachers. So these were the main measures they wanted to try and capture in those focus groups and questionnaires. Okay, so next one. So I thought it'd be good to just do one little breakout room, because I'll be really interested, because this is a really difficult thing to do. And the next phase of the project is the implementation phase. So we're going to try and take this draft education evaluation framework, and we want students to actually go out and implement it in a number of schools. So I think you were asking earlier, Derry, about sort of the action phase. So this next phase, which started last week, actually, in these two London schools, we're starting to plan, refine this, and we're going to try and implement it. So I'm going to stop sharing for a second and do some breakout rooms just for a few minutes. Be really interested to see what people think, and I'll jump in a breakout room as well, I think. So Is everyone all right with that? Is everyone fried? Probably
Yeah, I'm all right with it, but I wonder if I could just ask you a question before we do it.
Derek. Yeah, go for it.
Well, one of the problems, I mean, God knows what those kids from School 21 made of interviewing me if I was supposed to be an inspector. That's almost hilarious to think about it, but I'd be interested in a bit of feedback if you ever want to give me any. But one of the problems with life skills and soft skills, they're quite difficult to quantify. You have to do it by inference. You can look at attendance figures or you can look at exclusion figures, and they tell you something. But there were no instruments to use to accumulate data. And as you know, Ofsted love data. But now we've got Schleicher's new OECD report, Beyond Academic Learning, where he claims now to have perfected a whole bunch of indicators for life skills. And I wonder if your students know about that and what their opinions would be.
Yeah, well, that's a really interesting question. And when we started thinking how are we going to measure things like life skills and how are we going to measure things like personal development, having done the focus groups that they did and engaged with people in that particular framework of gathering information, their view was that they didn't think there would be, and I'm not saying there can't be, but they didn't think there would be a valid measure of things like life skills and personal development because you'd have to objectify the numbers and you'd have to make it in some way standardized. And one of the things that they thought would be much more powerful is doing that through presenting the themes that emerge from focus groups. And we haven't resolved this yet. We need to implement this, Derry, now and see how this actually works. So they might go in there and this cohort might do that, and they might try and track life skills and personal development through focus groups, and they might go, that's not possible. What we think they will definitely be able to track, they'll probably be able to tap into mental health. They'll probably be able to tap into whether students feel safe. I'm sure they'll be able to tap into things like teacher-student relationships through focus groups. But it's a really good question you asked there, and this is incredibly complicated, isn't it, how you measure some of these, particularly things like life skills and personal development. So the short answer there is we don't know yet, but we're going to give it a go this year and see how they get on. And then this new cohort of students will reflect upon it. But I just wanted to get you guys into breakout rooms and just have a discussion about what are the challenges going to be with implementing this year. So I'm essentially trying to be a bit selfish and pick your brains, really, try and find out what you think is going to happen and what might be the challenges. So, and before we do that, David, did you have your hand up?
I did.
Hi.
Just quickly, I'm hoping this will be received as it's intended as a bit of a tongue-in-cheek comment rather than a criticism. But I was wondering about the validity and the reliability and even the replicability of the findings that the children made. Yeah. If Derry was the person that they interviewed as being a kind of a representative of an inspection staff, because they're going to get completely a different message if they interviewed any other inspector. Because Derry speaks very powerfully about his beliefs and his experiences, which would probably go quite strongly against what anyone would anyone else in the inspection service would probably say.
There's two answers to that, David. Actually, probably three. The first thing is we obviously contacted Ofsted so we could interview Ofsted inspectors. They said no, we're not going to do this because it's not relevant to Ofsted.
Their loss, right?
Right. So that was one of the things. So we couldn't track their views because they didn't want to speak to the students. I think they could see that, we're trying to do a project that might challenge the status quo, and they didn't want to talk to us. They also interviewed a number of other ex-Ofsted inspectors who did have quite different views to Derry. But we're very aware that, when you do a project like this, one of the things that can easily be held up against you is how valid and reliable is the data. But then again, if you think about the fact that the way Ofsted are assessing now is to be conservative, spurious in terms of the theory it's based upon and the approach they take being something that's then being democratically chosen or in any way something that has tapped into the population as a whole, you could challenge it on the same grounds, I think.
David, can I just say, I did make it very clear to the bunch of students who interviewed me that my best work as an Ofsted inspector was to work against Ofsted in a court case. I don't know what they made of that, but I didn't pretend to be anything I wasn't. I made it pretty clear to them, and I think it was pretty clear to them, frankly.
Yes, but your views and opinions can still be quite strong and persuasive, especially if the other inspectors that were interviewed are maybe or probably aren't as strong in their opinions. I mean, obviously, I don't know. I'll wait to see what the report says, but
yeah.
Well, you'd have to blame Chris for that. I can only be who I am.
Absolutely. I think, you know, Derry was one view of many, you know, so there are a number of teachers involved in focus groups, lots of teachers involved in interviews, students involved in focus groups, and obviously Derry was one voice amongst many voices. So we tried to keep it as, you know, as valid and reliable as you can, but, you know, it's never going to be perfect, is it? Right. So 3 breakout rooms. So I'm really interested in what you guys think of what the students, what you've heard so far, and what the challenges are going to be, and if you have any ideas. So we'll just go in for like 5 or 6 minutes, and I'll join one as well. I'll be really interested to speak to some of you guys about it. Welcome back. I'd love to hear people's thoughts really after a bit of time to think about it. You might have gone on a complete tangent. That's absolutely fine in breakout rooms. That usually happens in breakout rooms, doesn't it? So if it has done, it's all good. But has anyone got any other thoughts before I move on? I just wanted to give people a chance to move around a bit. I know that I can't handle more than an hour without breakout room and wander. So any other thoughts, let me know. Feel free to unmute yourself. So I guess I was wondering, what are the challenges going to be with implementing this framework? And what might the strengths be, I guess? Those are the questions.
Just something that we did think, Chris,
Go on,
was
Terry.
that whatever the imperfections of the design of the research project, the fact that the voice of the kids, that they're being helped to develop their voice, and you're actually enabling that voice to be heard by politicians, policymakers and senior teachers, is in itself an incredibly useful thing.
Thanks, Terry. Yeah, I think we sometimes have to hold on to that, you know, because you hear and all this distress, don't you, from young people, and you think, what's the point? It's easy to just fall back on we're not making wide scale impacts at sort of national level. But I guess our approach is exactly that, Terry, with the, you know, even if it's transformative just for the cohort of students and some of the wider people around them within their schools and possibly their families and their peer networks, even if it's somewhat transformative in those contexts, to us, that's still a really successful piece of participatory action research.
The other thing was that a certain amount of surprise that the students didn't seem to be imagining an alternative approach to the whole content of GCSE and A-level, that they didn't seem to realise that in some countries there's a possibility for students to have far more control, far more self-directed opportunities than we provide them with in GCSE and A-level. Though I must say, when I was a vice principal, we did our best to choose syllabuses that lent themselves to as much student participation in decision-making about the content and of much sharing of the tasks of researching and presenting content to try and involve the students in that as much as possible. But there's only a certain amount you can do when you've got this high-pressured timetable and more content. And also you've got these so-called experts who think that we need more subject teaching, not less of it.
That's true, and you're always battling against that. And I suppose I'll talk a bit more about this right at the end, but the challenge of participatory action research is having that feeling, Derry, and going, you know, I know, because I've done a lot of thinking and talking to other people in other countries, what other education systems can look like, and democratic education can look like, for example. But the students have no prior experience of that. So they're to some extent quite indoctrinated by the education system as it stands. And the balance is, when does it become that you're telling them what to think about this? And when do you allow, and how do you allow them to develop their own sense of it? And we were trying to be really, really wary of pushing them in a certain direction, which is why we got a range of interviewees and a range of focus group participants who had different views. Very, very complex stuff. And participatory action research is, I think, for me, the most complex research I've ever done, because you have to position yourself as a researcher with the students, And that's very, very difficult to do without your own biases and ideas coming in. So really, really complicated question. And I think you're right, Derry. We was a bit surprised that they didn't talk more about educational freedom, as it were, and autonomy. But I think what they did at the end was they got to the point where they thought, if the things that are on here are measured, for example, personal development, for example, teacher autonomy, they perceive that that would lead to conversations that opened up the ideas you've just discussed there around broadening curriculum, broadening what an idea of education being for looks like. Okay, so what are the outcomes of last year? So one of the things that's really exciting is we documented the whole of last year's project. We're going to release a documentary soon, which is mega exciting. The students are absolutely buzzing about it, and that's going to come out. I'm not sure exactly when because COVID got in the way a bit, but we've tracked the whole process as it went through, and the students essentially built the documentary alongside a filmmaker called Kathy, who's an absolute genius. And obviously we're going to have some more doctorate research evolve from that phase of the project. Again, there's a bit of a lag time on that because we need to get it published. There's going to be more conference presentations, more interactions with the Education Select Committee. We're obviously very aware that, you know, that might not lead to anything really major, but I think what we're trying to do with this research is we're trying to start conversations and create counter narratives with the idea that education is underpinned by really strong collective narratives about what education is for, and what education looks like. So we're trying to add to the conversations created by people like Summerhill and the democratic school movements in a slightly different way, if that makes sense. And we've sort of come to that conclusion just through doing the work over time, really. I've got something from Tasha here. A problem on how the safe space to share their thoughts. Yeah, Tasha, that's a really great question. I'm going to come to that in a minute. I think she's gone now, hasn't she? But she's just asked a really good question there. Essentially, are students honest in those rooms when you're talking to them? And do they feel safe to share things when they're not listened to in the education system? I'm going to come to that at the end. It's a really, really great question. Okay, nearly at the end, you guys. So the new cohort started last week. We're now in the process, as someone asked earlier, of introducing them to the students from last year. There's 3 student innovators from phase 3 who are going to talk to the phase 4 students about implementing the process and reviewing that, refining it before we go out into schools and actually do it. So we started last week, and yeah, I'll just say a little bit more about that. So what we're going to be doing is, hopefully in the spring term, we're going to have had a chance to work with the students so that they understand what the review of progress development is, where it came from, the philosophical and psychological underpinnings of it, how the students got to the points where they were deciding they thought focus groups were a good idea and school self-evaluation was a good idea. And then they're going to implement it in a number of schools. So we think this is probably a news story. I mean, the idea of young people going into schools and essentially doing an alternative version of an Ofsted inspection, we think is quite an interesting idea, hopefully. So we think it might get some interesting pickup, hopefully from the media, so we can amplify some of the findings. And I just wanted, because a few people have asked about the process itself, what does participatory action research feel like and how can you set it up? So Tasha asked a really good question, and this is really powerful actually. So when we start this project, and it usually is just me in a room with 12 to 15 young people doing basically what they think is a school project for year 12. They walk into the room and they seem to assume it's going to be what you'd normally have with a school project. They think they're going to be sitting down, listening to the teacher, doing some writing, handing in assignments, etc. And the first few weeks are really interesting because they sort of treat me like a teacher. They call me sir. And obviously I'm trying to break that down. And I say, look, my name's Chris. I'm a researcher. I'm not a teacher. And we're all working together here in the same environment. We all have equal voices. And it takes them a long time, like 3 weeks, sometimes longer, to figure out A, that we're genuinely listening to them, B, that we are actually on an equal playing field and we're not going to tell them what to think or tell them what to write or mark assignments or place ourselves in a sort of higher position to them socially. And the big thing that then happens is, the third thing that we really notice is they start to open up. They start to be really honest about how they feel about school. They start to be really genuine when they start to develop trust with us as researchers. And then you start to come up with some really fascinating stuff. And the reason I wanted to show you Mentee Meter is because it's an amazing piece of software where the young people can write their ideas, as I showed you earlier, and you can record them, and then you can analyze their thoughts, and their thoughts are all posted anonymously on the Mentee Meter. So they don't have to feel worried about anyone judging them, because everything they write on the Mentee Meter, nobody knows where it came from. So we can basically do research all the way through the year. So whenever we do a session with young people, they'll record ideas, we'll use those ideas as part of our research, and to develop a consensus amongst the students about where they want to take the project. And the way we set it up, just one last thing on that, is we get students from School 21 and LE to actually apply to take part in the project, because we're very much based around the self-determination theory model. We want young people to autonomously choose the project. We want them to do it because they're intrinsically motivated to try and do it. And then we sort of take 12 of them who we think have done the best applications, and we go from there. So we're in a position now, we're in phase 4. We are about to hopefully implement the review for progress and development in some schools in the spring term, which is incredibly exciting. And we're not really sure what phase 5 looks like, because participatory action research is one of those things that evolves hopefully alongside the students, and we don't really know what's going to come next. But I think what would be really amazing is if we can implement the framework this year, refine it a bit more. And it might be interesting to see if any other school provisions would like us to do it in their schools, whether that be Summerhill or other democratic sort of schools around the world and around the country. Hopefully some state schools in England as well. We're trying to think big about it because we think it's quite a valuable project. And going back to one of the things Derry asked straight away at the beginning, we always want the students to be taking action in these sessions. So we want them to be creating something, try and implement those things in their environments and challenging systems that already exist. So I guess that's a sort of summary of the Breaking the Silence project going into phase 4, as I said now. And like I said, it's a complex process, and it's essentially about ideas evolving over time. So this is the last couple of slides now. So you start off with a little, the red circles essentially represent information. So you start with a little bit of information, and it might come from the students' own experiences of education, their raw experiences. How has it impacted upon them? And you start with that, and then you sort of think about that, and then you act on that, and you go, okay, so how is that relevant to this project? What do we need to observe? What do we need to think about to try and develop our knowledge? So the action might be to observe some research, watch some videos, read some articles, think about that together, reflect on what we've learned, and then the plan continues to move up. If that makes sense. So you're constantly going back to the students, checking that what they've put on the Mentee Meter and what we've recorded of their sessions reflects their views. So you've got this sort of constantly evolving data that comes directly from the students. So it's very complicated. It's quite challenging to do because of your positionality as a researcher, but it's really fascinating. We're hoping that it's going to continue over the next few years. The only slight problem we have maybe is going to be funding, because it's not easy to get funding for projects like this, as I'm sure some of you will be aware. And I think that's the last little bit, yeah. And for anybody who wants to get involved, we're UCL and States of Mind alongside lots of other participants. We want to try and start this movement called Education Futures in Action. And we want to bring together people who've taken part in this festival alongside universities, alongside various other people. And I'm supervising a doctorate student at the moment called Sapna, who's an amazing young woman. And what we want to try and do is bring different people together and try and come up with a shared conception of what kind of language we want to use in terms of taking education forward, what kind of underpinning philosophies we all have that we can share. I'll talk more about that as the months go on, but certainly you guys are invited to that. So I'm going to send some stuff around, and Kata, maybe you can help me to disseminate some stuff later. But this is a sort of evolving idea around bringing people together who are essentially trying to re-envision education to be more self-determined, and obviously therefore underpinned by autonomy, choice, and more student participation. And I feel like there's lots of us out there doing great work, and it's been amazing to interact with people like yourselves over the years. And I want to thank you, particularly Derry, for taking part in phase 3 of the research. What's next? hopefully I've explained that, but I just wanted to very quickly see if anyone has any other thoughts or ideas about what we could do next, or any other thoughts about things that you've heard today. Feel free to criticize, ask difficult questions. I'm very aware that no project is perfect and there are clearly issues with doing this sort of research. But yeah, any thoughts about what's next, or any thoughts about the presentation?
I think it's great, Chris, for the reason I've already said, really. A fantastic benefit to the students just to take part, and so important for there to be a channel of their views, perceptions and feelings to politicians and policymakers. I think that's so important.
Thanks, Derry. That's amazing. And the students, I mean, you saw the students talk, didn't you? I think there are 3 young people at the Ed Futures conference, and they presented that stuff to Robert Halfon and the Education Select Committee themselves. So I totally agree. I think that's really powerful stuff, and amazing for them as much as anything else, isn't it? For the students themselves. And I know it's had a really good impact on them in terms of where they're at now, and their confidence and their self-assured nature has been sort of instilled. Hi, David.
Hello. Yes, I just wanted to say I really enjoyed how you implemented the research. It wasn't just that you went out and kind of questioned the students, but you actually got them involved in kind of coming up with the process as well. So I really enjoyed that. I think, trying to think back, this is probably my first experience. I had heard of action research before, but I think this is the first example I've heard of where it's been actually applied. So as well, it's interesting from that front to see how it works.
Thanks, David. Yeah, that's really great to know. And I think I'd love you guys to have seen some of the interviews. I know Derry was interviewed by some of the students, but some of the best feedback we had on the project was teachers, for example, sitting in focus groups run by 17-year-old students. That was quite magical, actually. And they would come out of those sessions really buzzing and really feeling a genuine sense of empowerment, that they actually not just had a say, but they were able to shape how they looked at their own experiences in a way that might actually lead to something. So yeah, it was really cool. It's really cool to be part of.
Sorry.
Go on, Jackie, and then we'll come back to you, Derry.
So, sorry, Derry. Yes, no, just a quick follow-up.
Sorry, David. Yeah.
You said that they had you'd involved a 17-year-old in this. Are you planning, or have you thought about including younger students as well? Whether they'd be able to.
We'd love to, David. It's just only a capacity issue at the moment. It's only me at States of Mind who runs this project. So it takes obviously quite a bit of time to liaise with all the different people and supervise the doctorate students and then plan the sessions and all that. I think it would be really fascinating, wouldn't it, to do it with younger students as well. It's definitely something that we'd like to do in the future for sure. Yeah. I think Jackie was going to. Jackie, you were going to say something. That's all right, Derry.
No, not really.
Okay, sorry. I thought I heard
I'm grateful. Yes, no, that the young people have a platform from which to speak. I think that is so empowering. So thank you very much.
Oh, I totally agree, Jackie. That's the main purpose of this project. And I think one of the things that keeps happening is every year, and I think this is potentially really powerful going into the future if we can keep this project evolving, is 3 students from each cohort are now working with us all the time. So we've got 3 from 2 years ago, we've got 3 from last year, and we've got about 9 young people now who are co-designing what States of Mind is as an organization and all of our projects. So we think that's pretty cool, and we want to keep that evolving if we can, because I think it is really important, isn't it? It's not something that happens enough in our opinion. I think they're usually treated as subjects of research, aren't they, rather than participants. So we want to keep that rolling. So thanks, Jackie. Go on, Derry.
Yeah, I wrote a report for QCA when there was such a thing as QCA on how can government learn the opinions of students on the curriculum. How can government hear the voice of students? And I worked with students as researchers groups from 6th formers down to year 5 in primary schools.
Fantastic.
Yes, and although obviously the level of sort of intellectual development is quite different, the capacity to engage in the questioning and devising various approaches, focus groups, questionnaires, etc., to be able to learn about the basics of research. This can be communicated at quite a young age. I just wanted to say that to David, and I know a lot of Mike Fielding and Sarah what was her name? Sarah Bradshaw. No, it's not quite right. I know her as Sarah. But Mike and Sarah did a lot of work with younger kids and students as researchers. So that's a comment. And a question is, you haven't said a great deal about the continuity and accumulation of competence as groups take on the initiative. What opportunities do they have to learn from the previous group?
Yeah, see, that is a really difficult challenge, because by the time the students have done their phase, if that makes sense, they're in year 13, Derry, then. And the pressure, what we're finding is the pressure of their year 13 year, as in the exams, A-level exams, is very all-consuming. So what we're trying to do is get them to come to the sessions periodically. So the three student innovators who've chosen to stay involved with the project, we want them to come periodically to the sessions this year. We also want them to write their reflections on being part of the process. And we also want them to try and hopefully stay involved long-term to contribute to a sort of wider conversation as the research and the data develops and it expands. But that is really difficult, because you know what it's like, Derry, in mainstream sixth
Absolutely.
forms. There's huge pressure, isn't there, for them to just narrowly focus on their A-levels. So I'm sort of in a very difficult balancing act with the head of sixth form and the senior teachers, because I don't want to push too hard so that they pull out of the project, because I think it's amazing that we've got two mainstream schools taking part in this project, which is going to evaluate their schools. I mean, they're taking a bit of a risk there. So it's a balance for me between pushing so that we get the most out of it, if that makes sense, and not pushing so hard that they feel a bit like they want to reject the project or they feel undermined by it. So hard, basically.
Absolutely. I mean, this is the whole point behind the 20% movement, that 20% of curriculum time should be set aside for projects that have got nothing to do with the examination system. We made some process with the sort of individual essay at sixth form level. I don't know if your two schools are doing that, but they might like to have a look at the new Swiss national curriculum, which actually says schools must not fill up 100% curriculum time. They must leave 20% either for the school to decide what to do with it, or better still, for the students to decide what to do with it. I think
you're right. I mean, having read about the Swiss model myself, I think it's an interesting way of looking at it, isn't it? And I think what's happening even in School 21, which is interesting, is that there's huge pressure around academics in year 13, and they're very sort of forward-thinking, progressive school around this sort of thing and creating spaces for project-based learning. So it's a real challenge. I totally agree. Something we're working on all the time. And I'm very aware now, Kata, that that's probably time up, isn't it? Yeah? Fantastic. All right, guys. Well, I really appreciate you coming along. Has anyone got any final questions or comments before we close it?
Thank you.
Thank you for coming. Thank you for coming.
And thank you for coming. It was really very interesting what it's all about.
Oh, thanks, Kata.
I have to watch it again, because half of it just, went through my head.
Absolutely, yeah. There's a lot of information in there. So what I can do, Kata, is I can send you the summary of the project. It's called The Story So Far. It's 2 pages. It's got all the links to much more detail about things I've shown you guys here today. So I'll send you that and you can fire it around, Kata. And
do you mind if I share it on our social media pages or wherever?
Please do, yeah, please do. And if anyone wants to contact me, obviously my email's there. I'd love to talk to you about it. If anyone wants to get involved with States of Mind or get involved with any of our projects, that would be fantastic, because we're always looking for people who are trying to do similar things and trying to particularly elevate the voices of young people so that their views are actually have a place in our education climate, that's particularly in the state sector. There's your hand up over there. Someone's hand up. Hello.
We just want to share, we do apologize, we were not from the beginning because we had something else about gamification for 30 minutes. right before you, but people so wanted more, so we stayed, and so we just came.
Okay.
But this will be recorded. We would love to watch. But we are very much interested, Chris, to join hands, because for 15 years we've been interviewing kids and teenagers what kind of world they want. And 15 years ago, we wanted to create Summerhill-based school in Cape Town, South Africa. It's still idea. It didn't happen, but we really have this strong feeling or energy flow, in a sense, to literally create a platform where children are leading, because children are learning from adults who are part of wars, who are part of, we don't need to communicate. So, but if we give children their visions, and that we as adults, so to speak, are supporting children, what kind of world they want to live, because we're going to be dead by the time they grow up, so why don't reverse? So we are very, very interested in this presentation, if Kata can share, and if we can team up. I mean, if we can, of course, open conversation.
Please email me. My email address at the bottom of this. Email me. It'd be really good to hear from you. And that's literally what we're doing. All of our work is entirely driven by the voices of young people, and we're pulling more and more young people in, and that's amazing. So, I mean, I'm hoping to do this till I'm 70, and I'm 39 now. So imagine how many young people we'll have by then. There'll be hundreds of them. So yes, essentially, we'd love to. Yeah. So drop us an email.
Thank you.
Anyone else got any comments, thoughts? Okay, great.
Thank you very much.
Oh, yeah. Oh, thanks, David, and thanks for your really interesting and challenging questions. I think it's really important to be challenged, because I think this kind of research, we need to know where the fire is coming from, in terms of people wanting to shut it down and wanting to minimize it and wanting to project an idea that it is meaningless, which is going to happen. It has already happened to us a lot on social media. So it's really helpful to think, for example, about the validity and reliability questions which you asked. So I really appreciate that, David. Thank you.
Maybe a quick question, Chris. I see obviously is states of mind associated with UCL or the IOE?
So I'm a lecturer and sort of tutor at the Institute of Education, and I'm the main link, David, really. I was saying to Kata earlier, and I think she paused the recording. We were talking about how it's somewhat difficult with universities, because even though UCL is obviously a very prominent university in the world, they're not incredibly challenging to the status quo in education. So what I'm trying to do is make the right connections. There are lots of them at UCL, with people who are also trying to re-envision and challenge in the education sector. So I'm sort of the main link, but there are other academics who've sort of come on board and want to get involved with this in similar projects. So essentially we're linked via a number of people rather than in a sort of financial or organizational sense. Does that make sense?
Yes, I think so. I was just inquiring really, because I myself graduated from UCL psychology.
Oh, okay.
So yeah, it's brings back some memories.
Yeah. I mean, it's a great university. I just think we're trying to help form spaces where there's a bit more, I guess, from my perspective, more challenge going on, really.
Yes.
Because as academics, we've known for a long time that the education is exceptionally dysfunctional in England.
Yes.
And there's not an enormous amount of research around it. And participatory action research doesn't make any assumptions about the education system working, does it? So you go in with an open question and go to young people, how are you experiencing education? And from that emerges very different data than if you go in and say, we think the education system is fine, let's do an intervention to make dyslexic kids write quicker. Do you see what I mean?
Yes.
No,
I think it's the right approach.
Well, we think so, yeah. And we do come up against a lot of, I guess, sort of challenge, in the sense that it's not a normal way to do things, is it? What we're doing at States of Mind, it's very different side of type of research to what you classically get out of UCL and the Institute of Education. So it's challenging because it doesn't fit into a really clear framework in terms of what the general sense of research looks like. So it's very challenging, but I don't know, it's invigorating, David, and we're going to keep plugging away, I think. Any other thoughts? Amazing. Well, thanks for coming, everybody. Really appreciate you coming. And Kata, thanks for getting me along, and I know you guys are going to post hundreds of videos you have from the festival, which I need to catch up on, loads of them. So thanks everyone for coming, and yeah, drop me an email if you want to chat about it further. Thank you.